She stood at the edge of the old wooden porch, her hands still dusted with dried lavender and the faint stain of elderberry, watching the long black car wind its way up the gravel road like a serpent that didn't belong in these hills. The morning was gold and clean. Covenant Creek smelled the way it always did, pine resin and creek water, wood smoke and wild rosemary, and Grace Mercer breathed it in like a prayer, like armor, like everything she had ever known. She had heard rumors, of course, the whole town had. A doctor, a real one, they whispered at the general store, at the church steps, over back fences mended and unmended. A doctor from the city, from Atlanta, with degrees on the wall and hands that had never pulled a calf or pressed plantain leaf against a wound that would not stop weeping. She had smiled at the gossip, not unkindly. Let him come, she thought. Let him see what these mountains have been doing just fine without him for 200 years. But now the car was here, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the October air, something that felt, God help her, like a warning. Friends, if this story already has your heart, you are in the right place. Welcome to the Blessed Christian Storyteller. If you are new here, we tell stories of faith, love, redemption, and the grace that finds us in the most unexpected valleys of our lives. Before we go further, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below telling us, I am here for the story. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And now, settle in, because this story is going to take you somewhere real. Let us begin. Dr. Nathan Caldwell stepped out of his car and immediately understood two things. The air up here was cleaner than anything his lungs had ever processed, and the road to the clinic was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. He stood for a moment beside the open car door, his Italian leather shoes finding purchase on pale gravel that still held the morning dew, and he looked up at Covenant Creek, Tennessee for the first time. It was beautiful. He had not expected it to be beautiful. He had expected, well, he wasn't sure exactly what he had expected. His colleague Marcus had described it as a mission of mercy, which Nathan had taken to mean backward, under-resourced, and in need of his particular kind of rescue. He had come prepared for that mission. He had packed his best medical text, 4 boxes of pharmaceutical samples, a portable diagnostic kit that cost more than most of these families made in a year, and the unshakable confidence of a man who had graduated first in his class at Emory School of Medicine, done his residency at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, and turned down a partnership at one of the finest private practices in Buckhead to come here. Nobody could accuse Dr. Nathan Caldwell of not being committed. Even his mother couldn't quite figure out why he'd chosen this. Nathan, she'd said, gripping his arm at the farewell dinner she'd organized, silver candlesticks, her best china. You have gifts that belong to the world, not to some hollow in the mountains. He had kissed her cheek and told her, God disagrees, Mama. She had given him the look she always gave him when he invoked God, equal parts fond and suspicious, as though he suspected he was using the Almighty as a convenient escape from accountability. Maybe she was partly right, but the call was real. He'd felt it 3 months ago while sitting in his gleaming office reviewing lab work for patients he would never really know. Names on charts, insurance codes, 15-minute appointment slots, and something deep in his chest had turned over like a page, and he had known with the clarity he associated only with his best surgical moments that he was supposed to go. Go where the need is greatest, Nathan. So, here he was. The clinic was a converted farmhouse at the edge of the town's main street, a single street really, that bore the ambitious name of Providence Road. The building had a fresh coat of white paint that didn't quite conceal its age, and a hand-lettered sign that read, Covenant Creek Community Clinic, all are welcome. Inside, he found a waiting room with 6 mismatched chairs, a reception desk staffed by a cheerful woman named Dottie, who was somewhere between 60 and 100 years old, a single examination room, a small supply closet stocked with things that made him quietly wince, and a back office that would serve as his own. Dr. Caldwell, Dottie clasped his hand with both of hers. Her grip was strong as iron. Lord have mercy, we have been waiting on you. Folks are going to be so relieved. She leaned in conspiratorially, her eyes bright like a bird. We've been managing, but you know how it is. Folks out here, they don't always come in when they should, stubborn as the hills themselves." She laughed, a warm sound like a bell. "But they'll come for you. They will." "I hope so," Nathan said, and meant it. Now, Dottie continued, settling back behind her desk as though settling in for the most important briefing of her life. "There are some things you should know before you start seeing patients. First, everybody knows everybody. Whatever you say to one person is said to the whole town by nightfall, so mind yourself. Second, the Patterson twins aren't twins, they're actually cousins who just look exactly alike, and it's not polite to mention it. Third," she paused here, and her expression shifted slightly, something careful entering it. "Third, and this is the important one, Dr. Caldwell, you're going to hear about Grace Mercer." Nathan was already reaching for his stethoscope. "What about her?" "She's the one people go to when they can't afford the clinic fees, or when they just don't know to come here. Her mama before her, and her grandmother before that. The Mercer women have been herbalists in this valley for as long as there's been a valley. And Grace, she's good, Dr. Caldwell, she genuinely is. She's helped people through things that, well, I just want you to understand the situation before you encounter it." Nathan set down his stethoscope. "Are you saying she practices medicine without a license?" Dottie looked at him with patient eyes. "I'm saying she practices healing, whether that's the same thing as a conversation a great many people in this town would very much enjoy having with you." He was still thinking about that when his first patient walked in. He met Grace Mercer on Wednesday. He almost didn't recognize her as a woman of consequence. She came through the clinic's side door, not the front, which he would later learn was a statement in itself, wearing a canvas work jacket over a faded blue dress, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, a woven basket on her arm that smelled powerfully of something herbal and alive. She was not small, she had a presence that filled a doorway, but she was quiet about it, the way mountains are quiet. You didn't notice how large they were until you were standing at their feet. Nathan was at the reception desk reviewing charts when she appeared. Their eyes met. Hers were the color of creek water over dark stone, gray-green and shifting, intelligent and cautious, and they assessed him the way she imagined she assessed everything, thoroughly, without hurry, without flattery. "You're the new doctor," she said. It wasn't a question. "Dr. Nathan Caldwell," he said, extending his hand. "And you're Grace Mercer. Dottie mentioned you." Something moved across her face. Not offense, not quite. Resignation, maybe. She shook his hand. Her grip was firm and her palms were calloused, and she smelled of lavender and something earthier beneath it. "I came to drop this off for Dottie's hip," she said, lifting the basket slightly. "Arnica and comfrey salve. It's been helping her." Nathan looked at the basket. He thought about speaking. He thought about diplomacy. He thought about the fact that he had been in Covenant Creek for exactly 4 days, and the very last thing he needed was to start a conflict with the most influential alternative practitioner in the county before he had even done a full physical on a single patient. Then he thought about arnica and comfrey salve being applied to a hip that might, for all anyone knew without an x-ray, have a stress fracture. "What's Dottie's diagnosis?" he asked carefully. "She said it's the arthritis, the same hip she's had trouble with since her 50s. "Has anyone confirmed that with imaging?" Grace's chin lifted just lightly. "Dr. Caldwell, Dottie is 73 years old and has been living with her body for 73 years. She knows her own hip." "I'm sure she does. I'd still like to rule out a fracture before we applied topical anti-inflammatories and call it managed." The look she gave him was measured. Not hostile, he would give her that, but not warm either. It was the look of a woman deciding how much of a fight she was willing to have, with whom, and on what day. "She'll tell Dottie you'd like to see her," she finally said. "The salve is on the counter." She set the basket down and turned to go. "Miss Mercer?" he said. She paused, her back still to him. "I'm not here to step on your toes. I just want to make sure people are safe." She turned then, and the look on her face was something he couldn't quite read, layered and complex, and briefly, painfully honest. "I know exactly why you're here, Dr. Caldwell," she said quietly, "and I know what you think of what I do. I've heard it before." A pause. I just hope you'll take the time to watch before you judge." And she walked out into the October morning, and he stood in the doorway of his clinic, and, God help him, he could not stop watching her go. The conflict, when it came fully into the open, arrived on the back of a child named Tobias Webb. Tobias was 7 years old, the second youngest of 4 children belonging to Roy and Lynette Webb, who farmed 20 acres on the North Ridge. He had been running a fever for 6 days by the time Roy Webb carried him through Nathan's clinic door, and the boy's eyes were glassy and sunken, and his skin was the color of old wax. Nathan took one look at him and felt the specific, sharpened focus that had always come over him in a crisis, the narrowing of the world to this room, this child, this problem. "Why did you wait 6 days?" he asked Roy, and heard the edge in his own voice and tried to soften it. Roy Webb was a weathered man in his early 40s, with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being talked down to. "We went to Grace first," he said. "She's who we always go to. She had him on elderflower and yarrow tea, fever compresses, cool baths. It broke twice, we thought he was turning, but this morning—" Roy stopped. His jaw worked. "This morning, Lynette said it wasn't right anymore, said we needed the doctor." Nathan was already examining the child. High fever, 104.2, signs of dehydration. When he pressed Tobias's abdomen and the boy cried out, Nathan's stomach dropped. "I need to get him to the hospital in Harlan, now. This isn't a fever we can manage here. His presentation suggests appendicitis, and if that appendix ruptures—" He stopped. Roy Webb had gone the color of chalk. They got Tobias to the hospital. It was a race. The appendix had not yet ruptured, but it was angry and swollen, and another 12 hours would almost certainly have been fatal. The surgery was clean and successful, and by the following evening, Tobias was sitting up in his hospital bed demanding his mother's cornbread. Nathan drove back to Covenant Creek in silence. He found Grace Mercer at the clinic when he arrived. Dottie had called her, he'd figure out later why, and she was sitting in the waiting room, her hands folded in her lap, her face a study in controlled anguish. She looked up when he walked in. He's fine. Surgery went well. He'll be home by the weekend." She closed her eyes. Her lips moved briefly, silently, a prayer. Something about that caught him off guard. He hadn't expected it from her, or maybe he'd expected it and hadn't believed it would look this real, this unguarded. "Thank God," she whispered. "Yes," Nathan said. He sat down across from her. He was tired, and his scrubs smelled of hospital antiseptic, and his heart was still running 3 beats too fast from the adrenaline of the drive. He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Mercer, yarrow and elderflower will not treat appendicitis." She opened her eyes. "I know that." "Then why?" "Because he came to me with a fever of 101 and an upset stomach." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, not with anger, but with the raw fear of someone who had been quietly terrified for the past hour. It looked viral. It presented exactly like every other cold weather fever I have seen in this valley for the past 12 years. I was monitoring him, Dr. Caldwell. Roy and Lynette had my number. I told them the moment anything changed, they were to call me immediately, and I would reassess. Her hands, he noticed, were gripping each other tightly. "I am not reckless. I am not cavalier with lives. I love these people." "I know you do," he said, and he meant it. That was the most complicated part. He already knew she wasn't reckless. He had heard about her from too many people, had seen too much evidence of genuine care. But there are limits to what herbs can diagnose. There are limits to what observation can catch without imaging, without blood panels, without— "I know there are limits." The words came out louder than she intended. She stood abruptly, walked to the window, turned her back on him. The October light caught her braid, the tension in her shoulders, the way she was breathing, deep and deliberate, the way someone breathes when they're fighting for composure. Nathan waited. "I have never," she said finally, her voice quiet again and all the more forceful for it, "I have never pretended that what I do replaces all medicine. I know what it is, I know what it isn't, but these people, Dr. Caldwell, they have been coming to the Mercer women for generations because there was no one else, because the nearest doctor was 2 hours away, because the clinic fees meant choosing between medicine and food, because sometimes what you need isn't a prescription. Sometimes you need someone who knows your grandmother's name and will sit with you at 2 in the morning and hold your hand while you're afraid. She turned. Her eyes were bright but dry. I am not your enemy. I am not trying to play doctor. I am trying to be what my community needs, and I would appreciate it if, before you decide what that is, you would come and see it. The room was very quiet. Nathan thought about 7-year-old Tobias on that operating table. He thought about Roy Webb's chalk-white face. He thought about all the things that could have gone wrong, all the small moments where a different choice might have ended in catastrophe. And then, honestly, against his better judgment, he thought about what she had said, the 2 o'clock mornings, the grandmother's name, the hand-holding in the dark. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right. Show me. I'll come. I want to see what you do." He paused. "And I'd like it if we could agree to do one thing together, a triage protocol. If someone comes to you with anything that could be surgical or infectious or cardiac, anything with a red flag presentation, they come to me first, not instead of you, first." She studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, Grace Mercer nodded. It was not a peace treaty, not yet, but it was a beginning. He came to her on a Saturday, as agreed. Her place was 3 miles outside of town, up a lane that his car negotiated with difficulty, 2 ruts in the earth bordered by Queen Anne's lace gone to seed, and the last yellow bursts of autumn goldenrod. The farmhouse came into view around a bend in the lane, white clapboard, green shutters, a wide porch wrapped around the front and south side, hung with drying herbs tied in neat bundles, lavender, sage, chamomile, calendula, rosemary, things he didn't recognize but that smelled extraordinary together in the cool autumn air. A large garden occupied the south-facing slope beside the house, and even in October it was alive with late-season growth, kale and chard still standing proud, the skeletal frames of spent tomato vines, cold-hardy herbs in raised beds, and in the corner nearest the fence, a rose bush covered with the small, brilliant hips of a spent summer. Grace was on the porch when he arrived. Beside her sat a small, ancient woman in a rocking chair with a quilt across her lap and eyes the exact same shade as Grace's, the creek water over stone, but older and wiser and lit with a particular kind of amusement. "Mama," Grace said, "this is Dr. Nathan Caldwell from the clinic." "I know who he is." Mama Esther Mercer extended a hand that was 90 pounds of pure authority in 4'11" of bird-like frame. "I've been waiting to see what the Lord sent us this time." Nathan shook her hand carefully. "What he usually sends you?" "Trouble," said Mama Esther serenely, "and opportunity. Most times they're the same thing." Grace showed him everything. The drying room off the kitchen hung so thick with herbs it was like walking into a forest. The meticulous journals her grandmother started and her mother continued, and she herself maintained. Careful records of treatments, dosages, patient responses, contraindications, written in 3 generations of handwriting. The small consultation room where she met with patients, simply furnished but immaculately clean, with a low table and chairs and a window that looked out onto the herb garden. "I keep records on everyone," she told him, showing him a file cabinet that contained handwritten charts. "Every person I treat, every remedy, the date, and their response. I don't just wing it, Dr. Caldwell." "Nathan," he said. She glanced at him. "You can call me Nathan." He paused. "We're colleagues, after all, apparently." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, not yet, but softer than what she usually got from him. "Apparently," she said. They spent 4 hours together that morning. He watched her see 3 patients, a young mother with a nursing infant and chronic mastitis that hadn't fully responded to the antibiotic Nathan himself had prescribed. Grace added a warm compress protocol and a specific dietary change that Nathan admitted privately he should have thought of. An elderly man with seasonal allergic rhinitis that Grace managed with local honey and stinging nettle tea. Nathan found himself taking notes. And a teenager with anxiety who cried quietly on the chair across from Grace while Grace talked to her with the kind of unhurried, unashamed compassion that Nathan had been trained to admire and rarely had the appointment time to fully practice. He drove back to the clinic thinking. He spent the rest of that day reading. He read about herbal medicine, real peer-reviewed literature, not dismissive editorials, not the reflexive scorn he'd been trained to feel. He read about arnica's verified anti-inflammatory properties, about the evidence base for elderflower and viral feed route illness, about the clinical studies on stinging nettle and rhinitis. He read about the documented failure of conventional medicine to adequately serve rural communities. He read until midnight, sitting in his back office with a cold cup of coffee and a growing, uncomfortable feeling that his confidence had been sitting on a foundation thinner than he'd realized. That was the night Nathan Caldwell began, quietly and privately, to change. November came in cold and bright, and with it came a shift between them that neither named aloud. It started practically. Grace began referring certain patients to Nathan, the red flag cases as agreed, but also others where she felt a second opinion would serve better than her own certainty. Nathan began noting on patient charts when he suspected lifestyle and herbal support might be as useful as pharmaceuticals, and leaving the name Grace Mercer with a phone number. They met twice a week, at first by accident at the clinic or the general store, and then, almost without anyone deciding it, by arrangement. They would sit in the clinic's small back office with coffee from Dottie's battered percolator and talk about their shared patients. They disagreed constantly. Nathan found Grace's commitment to what he still privately called anecdotal evidence both admirable and maddening. Grace found Nathan's demand for clinical proof of everything both rigorous and sometimes cruel in its rigidity. "You want a study for everything," she said one afternoon, not unkindly, while rain drummed against the window. "But most of what I work with hasn't been studied because there's no money in studying it. You know who funds pharmaceutical research, Nathan. You know it isn't the lavender farmers." "The absence of a study isn't evidence that something works," he said. "No, but 200 years of careful, documented use by healers who had everything to lose if they got it wrong, that's not nothing either." He didn't have a clean answer for that. He hated not having clean answers. He was starting to suspect disturbingly that the absence of clean answers might be a more honest place to practice medicine than the clean certainty he'd carried here. But it wasn't just medicine that was changing between them. It was everything else. It was the way he noticed around the 4th week that she always brought 2 cups of something, some herbal brew that smelled like autumn concentrated into liquid when they met, and left one on the corner of his desk without comment. It was the way she laughed, which was rare, but when it happened, it remade the room entirely, a warm, unguarded sound that startled her as much as it startled him. It was the way she talked about her faith, matter-of-factly without performance, the way someone talks about a person they know well and trust completely, not a doctrine they're defending. "Do you pray for me?" she asked him once, apparently out of nowhere, in the middle of a conversation about a patient with chronic pain. He'd looked up from the chart. "I grew up in church. He stopped. What was the honest answer? "I used to, more than I do now. Medical school kind of..." He made a gesture that was supposed to be eloquent and felt instead like surrender. "Kind of what?" "Kind of made me feel like the world is a machine. You learn it well enough, you can fix it. There's not much room for..." He allowed her to intercept. "For mystery?" The word landed oddly. "I was going to say for faith." "Same thing sometimes," she said quietly, and then, with a gentleness that had nothing clinical in it, "I'll pray for you then, since you've gotten rusty." He didn't know what to say. He looked at her across his cluttered desk and felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not the adrenaline of a diagnosis, not the satisfaction of a solution, but something older and less explicable. something that felt, he thought, a great deal like being seen. He looked back down at the chart. "Thank you," he said to the page. He heard her small sound of acknowledgement and heard her rise to go and didn't look up until the door had closed behind her because he absolutely was not ready to look at what was happening here yet. He fell in love with her on the night of the first real snow. He wouldn't have called it that at the time. He would have called it concern, professional admiration, or the disorienting effect of isolation in a strange place on a tired man. He would have called it anything but what it was. But the heart knows what it knows, and it keeps its own records. It was the third week of November. Snow came out of nowhere the way it does in the mountains. A light dusting promised by the radio station in Harlan, 22 inches delivered by morning. Nathan awoke to a world transformed and entirely silent except for the weight of white. He was at the clinic at 7 despite everything. Dottie was already there, somehow, wrapped in a coat that could have housed a small family. "Elroy Pearson," she said the moment he walked in. 81, widower, lives up on the Pearson Ridge Road. Last time anyone checked on him was Monday, and now this. Nathan was already pulling on his coat. "Address? You can't drive it in this snow. The Ridge Road hasn't been plowed, and it won't be plowed today." Dottie looked at him steadily. "You need Grace. She knows that road, and she's already on her way here." Grace arrived in a battered four-wheel drive truck that looked like it had been navigating these mountains since before Nathan was born. She had the truck loaded with blankets, food, and her medical kit, the herbal one, and, Nathan noted with something that was not quite surprise, a proper emergency kit that she had apparently been quietly assembling over the past few years. There was a blood pressure cuff, oxygen saturation monitor, nitroglycerin tablets. He raised an eyebrow at the nitro. "Elroy has a heart condition," she said flatly. "I've been monitoring him for 2 years. You want to drive or navigate?" They drove in careful silence, the truck laboring through snow that swallowed the road in places. The Ridge Road was exactly as impassable as Dottie had said. They hiked the last mile on foot, breaking trail through snow that reached Nathan's knees. Grace walked ahead of him, confident and unhesitating, her breath making small clouds in the bitter air. And he watched her and felt the strange, specific respect that you only feel for someone who is genuinely, unaffectedly competent. They found Elroy Pearson on the floor of his kitchen, hypothermic and barely conscious, his hip almost certainly broken from the fall he'd taken the night before. His small wood stove had gone cold, his hands the color of ash. What followed was the most remarkable 2 hours of Nathan's medical career, and he had some remarkable ones. He and Grace worked without speaking more than was absolutely necessary, the wordless synchrony of people who understand this same emergency. Nathan stabilized Elroy's hip and managed his hypothermia, warming him slowly, carefully, monitoring his vitals. Grace made a fire from the wood box and had the small house warming within 15 minutes. She rehydrated Elroy with warm broth from her kit when he was conscious enough to swallow. She sat with him, talking to him in a low, steady voice, telling him about her garden and the snow and what she was going to bring him when the roads cleared, keeping him present, keeping him anchored, while Nathan worked. "Elroy," she said at one point, holding the old man's hand, "you know what the Lord says. Not your time yet, you hear me? Not yet." Elroy's lips moved. The faintest smile crossed his weathered face. They got him to the hospital in Harlan via emergency helicopter. Grace had called the dispatch from the truck's satellite phone before they'd even reached the house. He was admitted with a fractured hip, stage 2 hypothermia, and a secondary UTI that had been quietly building for weeks. He would spend 3 weeks in rehab. He would come home in December. Nathan and Grace drove back through the snow in the late afternoon when the clouds were turning the kind of lavender rose that only happens in winter mountains. Neither of them spoke for the first miles. Then Grace said, quietly, "He's not going to be able to live alone anymore." "No," Nathan agreed. "He won't want to leave that house. It's been his whole life." "I know." He paused. "We could help him find in-home care." She glanced at him, and this time there was nothing guarded in it. "We?" He met her eyes briefly across the truck cab, then looked back at the snow. "We," he said again. The word sat between them. small and warm and full of meaning, the whole way back to Covenant Creek. That night, alone in the little rental house he'd taken on the edge of town, Nathan sat by his window and watched the snow and thought about Grace's hands holding Elroy Pearson's gray ones, and about the quiet authority with which she moved through emergencies and through grief, and about the way she talked to God as though he was standing in the room, and about the fact that it was snowing in Covenant Creek and he did not wish he were anywhere else in the world. He sat for a very long time, and then he did something he hadn't done in almost 5 years. He bowed his head and he prayed. He wasn't eloquent about it. It was rough and stumbling and slightly embarrassed, the prayer of a man who has been away from home so long he's forgotten which door to knock on. But he meant every word of it, and he had a feeling, quiet and steady as the snow falling outside, that it was received. December came with the cold settled in to stay, and with it came the thing that changed everything. Her name was Abigail Mercer, and she was Grace's mother. Mama Esther, who Nathan had come to regard as one of the wisest people he had ever met, and also the most quietly terrifying, came to the clinic on a Wednesday with her hands folded and her face composed in the particular way of someone who has been rehearsing difficult news. "There is something wrong with my daughter," she said. "She doesn't know I'm here." Nathan sat. He listened. Over the past several weeks, Mama Esther told him, Grace had been experiencing symptoms she was dismissing as fatigue from the season, from overwork, from the demands of a brutal autumn. Headaches, intermittent double vision, numbness in her left hand that came and went, 2 episodes of what Mama Esther described as confusion, brief but frightening, during which Grace hadn't recognized where she was. Nathan went very still. He recognized the constellation she was describing. "Has she told you anything else? Any falls? She fell 2 weeks ago," Mama Esther said. "She told me she tripped on the porch step. She had a bruise on her temple." The old woman's voice didn't waver. Her eyes were very bright. "My Grace, she takes care of everyone in this valley. She has never, her whole life, allowed anyone to take care of her. Not since her father left when she was 11 years old, and she decided right then and there that she would be the strong one." Mama Esther paused. "I need you to take care of her, Dr. Caldwell, even if she won't let you." Nathan spent the rest of that day in a state of very controlled dread. He knew what he was afraid of. He wouldn't name it yet. He needed data before he named it. He saw Grace the following morning. He asked her to come in for a general checkup. "We should be establishing baseline records for each other," he said, which was technically true. She agreed, with the slight suspicion of a woman who has spent her life watching the people she loves get sick and wondering if she will be able to stop it. He examined her carefully, thoroughly, the way he would examine anyone he cared about, which is exactly what he did with Grace. He cared about her. He had perhaps been the last person in Covenant Creek to understand this, but he understood it now. The examination alarmed him. Subtle findings, each one individually dismissible, but together, the mild papilledema he found on fundoscopic exam, the slight coordination asymmetry, the reflexes, together they spoke of something pressing where there should be nothing. He referred her that afternoon for an emergency MRI at the hospital in Harlan. She went. She went alone, which hurt him in a way he didn't examine, and she was back in Covenant Creek by evening, and she called him. He drove to her house in the dark, through cold that bit through his coat, and she met him on the porch with the lamp on behind her and her face carefully, painfully composed. They found a mass, posterior fossa, cerebellum, possibly meningioma. They want a biopsy to confirm. She stopped. She was holding herself very upright and very still. "The neurosurgeon in Harlan is referring me to Vanderbilt. They want to operate." The porch light caught the tears on her cheeks that her voice was refusing to acknowledge. Nathan crossed the porch in 2 steps and did what he had not yet permitted himself to do. He put his arms around her, he pulled her in against his chest, and he felt her go rigid for one moment, the resistance of a woman who has not allowed herself to be held in a very long time. And then she came undone, quietly, the way someone comes undone when they've been holding too much for too long. And he held her while she cried in the cold December dark, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Because sometimes the most medical thing you can do for someone is simply not let go. When she finally pulled back, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, and the familiar Grace returned. Not the frightened woman of a moment ago, but the healer, the capable one, the one who had made peace with hard things before. "I'm scared," she said simply. "I know." He kept his hands on her arms, steadying. "I'm going to Vanderbilt with you." "Nathan, I'm going," he said, and something in his voice apparently settled it, because she didn't argue again. The drive to Nashville was 6 hours, and they made it in near silence that was not uncomfortable, but rather full, the kind of silence that holds more than words can. Mama Esther had insisted on coming. She sat in the back seat of Nathan's car, with her quilt on her lap and her Bible open, and she hummed hymns under her breath the whole way, soft, continuous, like a heartbeat. Rock of Ages, It is well with my soul, great is thy faithfulness. Nathan found himself listening. He found the hymns doing something to the tension in his chest, loosening it slightly, the way a good breath loosens the shoulders. Grace slept against the window for the first 2 hours, and he drove carefully, not wanting to wake her, watching the mountains give way to foothills, give way to the broad, flat-lit approach of the city. He had called in every favor he had at Vanderbilt. Dr. Serena Walsh, his former attending, the finest neurosurgeon he knew personally, had cleared her schedule. "You vouch for her, Nathan, that's enough for me," she said. He felt a complicated gratitude that he was someone whose vouching meant something, paired with the knowledge that not everyone in Covenant Creek would have had someone to call. The biopsy confirmed what the imaging had suggested, a meningioma grade 1, the best possible news in a category of news that is never good, benign but large enough and positioned such that it needed to come out. Dr. Walsh was confident. "Grade 1 meningiomas are my bread and butter," she told Grace with the particular calm authority of someone who has done 3,000 of a thing and knows exactly which ones to be afraid of. Grace looked at her. Her expression was something she hadn't seen on her before, open and undone and grateful in a way that had nothing defended about it. "You talked to her about my work," she said. "I bragged about your work," he corrected. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked away, and I saw the movement in her throat that meant she was keeping something back. "Nathan," she said quietly, "why are you here, really?" He considered the answer. He had several, all of them honest, all of them pointing in the same direction. He chose the most honest. "Because," he said, "somewhere in the past 2 months, Covenant Creek stopped being where I was sent and started being where I live. And you," he stopped, he tried again, "you are part of why that is." She was quiet for a very long time. The hospital corridor hummed around them, the white noise of healing, of urgency, of lives in motion. "I am afraid of depending on people," she said finally. "I have been afraid of it since I was 11 years old and my father left on a Tuesday without saying goodbye, and I watched my mama hold this valley together with her bare hands because there was no one else." She paused. "I have spent my adult life being the one people depend on. I am not," her voice caught, "I am not practiced at it going the other way." "I know," he said gently. "And you," she turned to look at him, and her eyes were the creek water again, dark and searching. "You came in here so certain about everything, so sure that your way was the right way. I didn't trust you." "I know that too. I wasn't very trustworthy at first." "You've changed," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was something closer to wonder. "You changed me," he said. "This place did. God used it to... He stopped. He was not accustomed to saying things like this aloud, this cleanly. He pushed through the unfamiliarity. I came here thinking I was going to rescue a community, and it rescued me. I had lost something, my faith, mostly. My sense that medicine was about more than the machine I was maintaining. You gave that back to me. He paused. You and Mama Esther's hymns and 73-year-old Dottie who could arm wrestle me and win, and Elroy Pearson on his kitchen floor in the snow. All of it. Grace looked at him for a long, searching, undisguised moment. I trust you, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, with the surgery, with all of it, I trust you. And she took a breath. I am grateful you are here. I am grateful in a way I don't have vocabulary for yet. It was not a declaration. It was not a kiss or a promise or a resolution. It was something more foundational than all of those things. It was two people acknowledging, carefully and honestly, that something between them was real. Nathan reached out and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers closed around his, and they sat in that hospital corridor in the white hum of other people's emergencies, and neither of them let go. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday, and the 3 days before it were among the most vivid of Nathan's life. He and Grace and Mama Esther took a small rented apartment near Vanderbilt, the kind of place that serves the families of patients, anonymous, practical, and inexplicably comforting in its ordinariness. They cooked together in the small kitchen, Grace making herb teas and simple meals with the herbs she'd brought in a bag from home, Mama Esther producing from somewhere an inexhaustible supply of hymns and wisdom, Nathan contributing what he was honest enough to admit was the least impressive cooking in the room. They talked. They talked more and more honestly than Nathan had talked to anyone in years. Grace told him about her father, a traveling salesman named Daniel Mercer, who had appeared in Covenant Creek one spring and married her mother in a summer romance that the whole valley still talked about, and who had lasted 12 years before the smallness of the mountains and the largeness of his restlessness had driven him away. He wasn't a bad man, Grace said, sitting cross-legged on the couch with her hands around a mug of chamomile. He was just a man who was always somewhere else in his heart. And when you're 11 years old, all you know is that someone decided you weren't enough reason to stay. You were enough reason, Nathan said. It came out more simply and more fiercely than he had intended. She looked at him. I know that now. I've known it for years. But 11-year-olds don't know it, and 11-year-olds don't always finish growing up. He told her about himself, things he had not told anyone, or not in a long time, about growing up the son of a driven, ambitious woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school, and who had taught him, by example and by direct instruction, that excellence was the only acceptable form of love. About the way he had carried that into medicine and into every relationship, the relentless competence, the need to fix, the terrible fear underneath all the confidence that if he ever stopped being useful, he would stop being worth anything. Is that why you came here? Grace asked. To be useful? Partly, he admitted, and partly because I was starting to suspect that usefulness wasn't the same as meaning, and I needed to find somewhere that would teach me the difference. Has it? He looked at her. Yes. Mama Esther, who was pretending to read her Bible in the armchair across the room, made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been a very quiet amen. Nathan and Grace both looked at her. Don't mind me, Mama Esther said serenely, turning a page. I'm just reading. The night before the surgery, Grace couldn't sleep. Nathan found her at 2 a.m, sitting on the apartment's small balcony in the cold December air, wrapped in Mama Esther's quilt, looking up at a sky that was too city-lit to show many stars. He brought 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside her. Scared? He asked. Terrified, she said without pretense. Not of dying, or not only of that, of waking up different, of the surgery changing something I can't name yet, of coming home to Covenant Creek and not being, she gestured, a motion that encompassed everything she was, not being this anymore. The surgery won't change who you are. You don't know that. No, he admitted, I don't. But I know you, and I think who you are goes deeper than a tumor can reach. She looked at him, and in the cold city light, her face was open and exhausted and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. Nathan, if something, she started. If nothing is going to... Let me finish. Her voice was firm. If something goes wrong, I need you to look after Mama and look after the work. The journals, they should go to someone who'll use them. I've been thinking about... There's a young woman in town, Addie Rallins. She has a gift for it. Nathan, he said. He set down his mug. He turned to face her fully. Nothing is going to go wrong. Dr. Walsh is the best I know, and I will be there the entire time. I will be there when you wake up. I will drive you home. I will sit on your porch and drink your terrible herbal tea and argue with you about the evidence base for stinging nettle for however many years you will tolerate my company. He paused, which I hope is quite a few. She held his gaze for a long, cold December-long moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her and pulled the quilt around them both, and they sat in that hospital corridor in the white hum of other people's emergencies, and neither of them let go. I think I love you, she said, very quiet, into the dark. He held her a little tighter. I think I have for a while, he said. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else to say. Surgery day. Nathan had stood in operating rooms for the most consequential moments of other people's lives, so he thought he knew what it felt like to be on the outside of the glass. He did not. He had never known. He understood that now, sitting in the surgical waiting room at Vanderbilt Medical Center with Mama Esther beside him, her hand folded over his, her lips moving in continuous silent prayer. You love her, Mama Esther said. It was not a question. Yes, Nathan said. Good. She patted his hand. She loves you too. She's been fighting it about October. A small pause. She fought everything worth having, that girl. Her father left, and she decided loving things too much was how you got hurt. But the Lord is persistent. Mama Esther smiled, and Nathan saw in it a lifetime of watching over a daughter she could not protect from everything. The Lord kept sending her reasons, the plants, the people, the work, and then he sent you, Dr. Caldwell. She looked at him steadily. Don't waste it, Dr. Caldwell. I won't, he said. He meant it with everything in him. The surgery took 4 hours and 12 minutes. Nathan counted every one of them. He prayed through most of them, really prayed, with something like fluency returning, the way a language comes back when you're desperate enough to need it. He prayed for Grace's life. He prayed for Dr. Walsh's hands. He prayed humbly and specifically for the grace to handle whatever outcome came. He prayed in a language that had nothing to do with medical school and everything to do with the thing that medicine alone could not account for, the inexplicable contingency of every human life. The fact that healing is never entirely the province of the healer. Dr. Serena Walsh came through the double doors at 1:30, still in her scrubs, her face professionally composed, but with something warm behind the composure. Nathan was on his feet before she was halfway across the room. Clean margins, complete resection, no complications. She's in recovery and asking for her mother. A beat. And for you. Mama Esther made a sound, not words, just sound, and it was the most thoroughly grateful sound Nathan had ever heard from a human throat. She pressed her hand to her heart, her lips moved. Thank you, Lord, thank you. Nathan sat back down. He put his face in his hands for a moment. He was not ashamed of crying, exactly. He was surprised by it. The force of the relief, the degree to which he had been holding the terror at bay with discipline and prayer, and the performance of steadiness. When the dam went, it went. Mama Esther put her small, strong arm around him, and he let her. Come on, she said when he'd collected himself. "Go see your girl." Grace came home to Covenant Creek on a Tuesday, 10 days after surgery, in the back seat of Nathan's car with a healing incision at the base of her skull and Mama Esther's quilt on her lap, and a small potted rosemary plant on the seat beside her that she had, inexplicably but characteristically, insisted on buying at a Nashville grocery store the morning of her discharge. "You're buying plants," Nathan said, at the grocery store, in the tone of a man who has accepted that this is his life now. "Rosemary is for healing and remembrance," she said. "I'm not going home empty-handed." He had bought the rosemary. Of course he had. Covenant Creek turned out to greet her. Nathan had not expected this, or not at this scale. As they turned onto Providence Road, he saw them, gathered on both sides of the street in the cold December morning, bundled in coats and hats and scarves. The Webbs were there, Roy and Lynette with Tobias on his father's shoulders, waving. Dottie stood at the clinic door in her enormous coat, both hands pressed to her cheeks. Old Elroy Pearson, home from his own rehab, leaned on a walker at the edge of the crowd and raised one hand in salute. Pastor Silas from the Valley Church stood with his congregation, and someone, Nathan would never entirely establish who, had hung a hand-painted banner across the front of the general store that read, "Welcome home, Grace. God brought you back to us." In the back seat, Grace pressed her hand over her mouth. "Nathan," she whispered, "I didn't do this. This is all them." She looked at the gathered valley, at the people who had drunk her teas and brought them their children and their fears and their midnight emergencies for 12 years, and she cried the way she had cried on the night of her diagnosis, openly, without defense, without apology. Nathan stopped the car and went around to open her door, and he helped her out carefully, one hand steadying her arm, and she leaned against him briefly, just a moment, just enough to feel the solid reality of him, and then she straightened and walked into the arms of Covenant Creek. He stood by the car and watched her, and he thought, "This is it. This is the thing I drove away from Atlanta to find. Not a mission, not a rescue. This web of people who know each other and love each other imperfectly and persistently. This valley that heals and is healed, this woman moving through her people like light through water." Dottie appeared at his elbow. "You're staying," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nathan said. "Good." Dottie tucked her arm through his with the authority of someone who considers this matter settled and always had. "Come have some coffee. Mama Esther brought cinnamon rolls." He stayed for the cinnamon rolls. He stayed for the coffee. He stayed because Covenant Creek had become, in 3 months, the truest home he had ever had. He stayed because the work was real here, gritty and human and unmediated by the comfortable distance of a city practice, and because it had made him a better doctor and a better man. He stayed because Grace Mercer was here, and because she had prayed for him when he was too rusty to pray for himself, and because she had shown him that healing was larger and older and more varied than what he had been taught, and because she had held Elroy Pearson's hand in a cold kitchen and talked him back to the living, and because she had said, "I think I love you," into a December sky and meant every syllable. He stayed because God had sent him here, and it turned out God knew exactly what he was doing. They built something, the two of them, in the months that followed. It happened slowly and honestly, the way things that last are built, argument by argument, compromise by compromise, discovery by discovery. The Covenant Creek Community Clinic expanded. Nathan wrote a successful grant proposal that brought in funding for a second examination room, a lab analyzer, and a part-time nurse. Grace's herbal practice was formally incorporated into the clinic's integrative care model, the first such partnership in the county, possibly in the state, and a subject of considerable interest from a university research team in Knoxville that came to study them that spring. "You're famous," Nathan said, reading the proposal. "They want to publish about your grandmother's journals." "They can publish," Grace said, without looking up from her garden, "but those journals stay with the Mercer family." He grinned and went back to the proposal and wrote in the margin, "Journals remain with the Mercer family, non-negotiable." The university agreed. Tobias Webb came to visit the clinic in February, healthy and round-cheeked and mildly heroic in the consciousness of his own surgery. He brought Nathan a drawing he'd done in school, a picture of two people in a clinic room, one taller with a stethoscope and one with what appeared to be a bundle of herbs. Under it, in careful first-grade printing, Dr. Nathan and the Flower Lady. Nathan kept the drawing. He had it tacked to the wall behind his desk for the rest of his time in Covenant Creek, which was to say, the rest of his life. It was a Sunday in late April when Nathan proposed. He had not planned it with the precision he brought to other important things. He had, if he was honest, been carrying the ring since February, a simple gold band set with a small, deep green tourmaline that was the color of creek water over stone, and waiting for a moment that felt like grace. It came on Grace's porch on a Sunday afternoon when the mountains were coming alive with the first green and the dogwood along the creek road was a riot of white blossom, and Mama Esther was inside pretending to nap but almost certainly listening through the window screen. Grace had been showing him the new growth in the herb garden, the lovage coming in strong, the comfrey sending up its first purple bells, the roses she was training up the south fence beginning to leaf. She turned from the rose fence and found him on one knee on the porch boards before he had even spoken. She stared at him. "Grace Elizabeth Mercer," he said, and his voice was steady, the way he was steady in an emergency, the way he was steady when it mattered. He looked up at her, and everything he felt was on his face, unguarded, unhidden, entirely present. "I came to Covenant Creek to find a purpose. I found something much better than a purpose. I found you. I found a home. I found my faith again." He paused. "I know I was arrogant when I arrived. I know I had a lot to unlearn and I'm still in the middle of it. I know you are independent and capable and would survive perfectly well without me. I am not asking you to need me." He looked up at her, and everything he felt was on his face, unguarded, unhidden, entirely present. "I am asking you to want me, the way I want you, every day for the rest of our lives, in this valley, doing this work, growing old, arguing about stinging nettle and the evidence base for everything." He held up the ring. "Will you marry me?" Grace looked at him for a long, suspended moment. The dogwood was blooming. The creek could be heard just distantly over the birdsong and April wind. Mama Esther made a sound through the window screen that was either a sneeze or a suppressed sob. "You kept the arnica salve I left for Dottie," she said. Nathan blinked. "What?" "On the first day, I left it on the counter and you kept it. You didn't throw it away. I noticed." Her voice was very soft. "I thought maybe there was hope for you." "Was there?" She stepped off the porch step and went to her knees in front of him in the April grass, which he hadn't expected, and she took his face in both her hands, the calloused, capable, herb-scented hands that had held the sick and the dying and the frightened, and she kissed him once simply, and then she pulled back and looked at him with her creek water eyes. "Yes," she said, "to all of it." The screen door opened. Mama Esther appeared, fully awake and radiantly unsurprised, with a jar of sweet tea in each hand. "I made refreshments," she announced. "I had a feeling." Nathan put the ring on Grace's finger and stood and pulled her up with him, and she leaned into him and laughed, that rare, warm, unguarded laugh that remade the room, or in this case, the whole mountain morning. And he held her in the April light while Mama Esther beamed, and the dogwood bloomed, and the creek ran cold and clear over its old stones. They were married in June, in the Valley Church, in a ceremony that the entire town of Covenant Creek attended. Grace wore her grandmother's wedding dress, remade to fit her, and she carried rosemary for healing and white roses from her own fence. Nathan wore his best suit and a look on his face that Dottie described to everyone who would listen as a man who finally figured out where he belongs. Pastor Silas read from Ruth, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay." And from 1 Corinthians, "Love is patient, love is kind." And from his own prepared remarks, "These two people have spent the better part of a year arguing about whether herbs or medicine saves lives. The answer, as anyone in this room could have told them, is that love does, and faith, and the stubborn refusal to stop showing up for the people in your care." There was not a dry eye in the building. Tobias Webb, who had been appointed ring bearer and took the responsibility with immense 7-year-old gravity, made it all the way to the altar before whispering loudly to his mother, "Mama, the flower lady is the prettiest thing I ever saw." She was. She was. And Dr. Nathan Caldwell, first in his class from Emory, who had come to Covenant Creek with a portable diagnostic kit and 4 boxes of pharmaceutical samples and the unshakable confidence of a man who had all the answers, looked at his bride and understood, with the wholeness of a man who has been well and truly humbled and is grateful for every moment of it, that the greatest things in his life had not come from what he knew. They had come from what he was willing to learn. Covenant Creek changed and did not change. The clinic grew, a 3rd examination room by the following year, a visiting specialist 2 Fridays a month, a telemedicine partnership with a children's hospital in Nashville that extended pediatric care to the valley for the first time in a generation. Nathan's reputation, not as the city doctor who had come to rescue the mountains, but as the doctor who had been humbled and grown by them, brought other young physicians through on fellowships and rotations, and more than a few of them ended up staying longer than they planned. Grace's integrative practice was written up in the Journal of Rural Health, which she read with a complicated expression and then filed carefully in the cabinet alongside her grandmother's journals. She trained Addie Rollins, the young woman she had identified even in her most frightened hour as someone with a gift for it, and watched with deep satisfaction as Addie began to bloom into the next generation of Mercer tradition healing. Mama Esther lived to 91, rocking on the porch through every season, humming her hymns, pronouncing on all matters with the unassailable authority of someone who had seen everything and forgotten nothing. When she passed, on a morning in October, with the leaves gold outside her window and her quilt on her lap, and Grace holding one hand and Nathan holding the other, she went the way the faithful go, peacefully, and with the particular expression of someone who has been expecting good news and is not disappointed. They had 3 children. The oldest, a daughter named Esther Ruth, inherited her grandmother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and her father's analytical mind, and was, at 7 years old, already treating the garden with the reverence of a future healer. The twins, boys, which delighted the entire town, were named Daniel and James, and showed every early sign of being exactly the kind of trouble that keeps a valley alive. On the anniversary of Nathan's arrival in Covenant Creek, every October, when the air smelled of pine resin and creek water and wood smoke and wild rosemary, Nathan and Grace would walk the lane to the old farmhouse in the evening when the mountains were turning rose and amber in the last light, and they would sit on the porch where he had first seen her, and they would be quiet together in the good way. Grace would sometimes say, "Do you remember what you thought of me that first day?" And Nathan would say, "I thought, put away your plants and practice real medicine." And Grace would laugh. And he would watch her laugh and think, as he had thought 10,000 times since that first October morning, that there was no medicine in the world that did that sound. That the greatest healers he had ever known had taught him that the human heart is not a machine and does not respond to machines. And that sometimes the most powerful thing in your kit is not a scalpel or a drug or a diagnostic test, but a presence, warm, faithful, persistent, that says, "I am here. You are not alone. We will face this together." The Lord had sent him to save Covenant Creek. Covenant Creek saved him right back. And somewhere between the herbs and the stethoscopes, between the ancient journals and the clinical evidence, between 2 people who arrived as adversaries and left as one, there, in the crossing place, the healing had happened. The real healing. The kind that lasts. And that, beloved, is the story of Nathan and Grace, of pride that was broken open by grace, of a healer who needed to be healed, of a woman who guarded her heart so long that when love finally found the door, it was worth every year of the waiting. We serve a God who knows exactly what He is doing when He sends us into places we did not choose and into the lives of people we did not expect to love. If this story moved you, if it touched something in you today, please leave a comment below. Tell us what spoke to your heart. Like this video and share it with someone who needs this message right now. If you have not yet subscribed to the Blessed Christian Storyteller, now is the time. New stories of faith, love, and redemption every week. Because every single one of us is a story God is still writing, and the best chapters, they are always the ones that surprised us. Until next time, be blessed, be loved, and keep the faith.